Thank you everybody to joining our latest instalment of the Advanced Plant Growth Centre seminar. It's a great pleasure today to introduce Professor Paul Gauthier at the University of Queensland. And Paul has a really interesting career that spans both academia and industry. So I'm looking forward to a very sort of wide-ranging and interesting seminar today. Paul, I'll let you take over and introduce what you're going to talk to us about. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Rob, and it's a great pleasure to be here today and presenting on a very exciting topic about technology and AI and how we could eventually break the glass ceiling of yield in vertical farming. So that's really what I'm going to talk about today. All right. Okay, so before we get started really into the depths, what I wanted to do is to go through the history of vertical farming in a certain way. These days, we have seen a lot of ups and downs in vertical farm, but I think it's important to remember how did vertical farm started in the US almost 14 years ago now, and really understand what was the context then and what is the context now. So that's really what I'm going to do, coming back to the historical development of vertical farming, and then we're going to switch into the high technologies that we are seeing today. And I think it's also important to remember that 14 years ago, AI did not exist. We didn't talk about AI as the way we were talking about, and neither we were also talking about the technology we have access today. So it's really an exciting time to be talking about this. So as I said, vertical farming got started more or less 14 years ago. It really got kicked off and really started fast around 2015. And at the time, the vertical farming was making economical sense, mostly driven by a few millennials that were really excited about the project. And if you look at these people and sort of were driving the industry, they were the coming from the climate generation that really started to enter into the market. So as the climate generation enters the market, they were asking for tastier, but also more local food. They were more concerned about the origin of the food and where it was coming from. And that really drive an aspect of local food production and all of that. They were also conscious about their health, and that's a parameter that is important across the world. It's important where I'm at the moment in Australia, where we have still pesticides that the rest of the world is not using, but also in the US, we had definitely a lot of pesticide, and this new generation was very concerned about it, and they were looking for new solution and new options to eat something better in a certain way. And also, that's also when, in 2010 and 2015, that where the social media really started to take. I mean, it was already important in 2000, but it was really more like massive there, with a lot of influencer really getting into it. And so the social media led the industry to have access to what I call a cheap advertisement. You take a box of lettuce, you send it to an influencer, you make a video on it, and then suddenly you have advertisement almost for free. It's very cheap marketing, but it's a good way to reach a lot of people, and especially the generation that you are targeting. And all of that was kind of defined as hype. We tend to have a quite negative vision on hype, and people tend to say, well, hype was pretty bad, and we are a few in the field that have been going against hype. Not that hype was actually negative. The reason why we wanted to go against hype was because there is something further after the hype, and the hype was really there to drive forward the industry. So we have seen that in the 2010, 2015, and that's really what got started the vertical farm industry in the US. So all this influenced by this new generation coming to market really had an impact to the point that if you look at the definitions that the group McKinsey have analyzed in terms of the different generation, if you just compare the baby boomers and the Gen X compared to the Gen Y and the Gen Z, you could see that just at the consumption level at the bottom, it's very different, the expectation. It's all about experience, sharing with their friend, have something unique, also eventually ethical, so sustainability comes into the aspect. So that was the demand that the new generation coming to the market was really asking. And of course, you could imagine that well, it makes sense that a lot got started around New York City, which is in the US, which is really a very dynamic city. And then it really spread across the US as this, Gen Y and Z, got into even, bigger and bigger into the market. So that really make a significant impact. And again, that was the situation we had at the time. But also we need to remember that the vertical farm really got started after the book of Professor Dixon Despommier from Columbia University, where he wrote this book called The Vertical Farm. And in The Vertical Farm, it's kind of a visionary perspective that really shape the vertical farming industry across the world, not just in the US, but across the world. Interestingly enough, it actually took a few more years for this book to have an influence across the world, but it really started in the US, and Dixon actually talked to a lot of different people that wanted to start vertical farm and really influence them in a way of like this visionary vision of like aspect of looking at building a skyscraper to feed people. So growing food into a skyscraper and how we are going to do that. He actually recently kind of a correct or not correct, but rewrite a version of the vertical farm. And in his book, he actually come back to the lessons that he's learned from that. And there's a lot of very interesting part. But in 2010, when this book was published, he was also questioning our current practices. It was, definitely there's some questioning about, the amount of pesticide we're using, also the land that is decreasing. So there's a lot of very interesting questions that today we know for, we know them very well. We talk about them almost every time we do a presentation on vertical farming. I'm definitely not going to talk about it today, but that's kind of like we have this context. And it was also a wake-up call, in my opinion, for the world on the situation on the food. I mean, we knew we had a food crisis, but somehow this book have created almost kind of like we are more conscious of it now. And so that's really where the vertical farm really had an influence. However, what is interesting about this book is, first of all, Professor Despommier is not a plant physiologist or even a plant person. And so that's an interesting point. And then the other thing is there is actually no economics into the book. So whether it's going to work or not, that was not the point. The point was to really be inspirational and he actually shaped many pioneers company across the world. So that's really a context. But Dixon Despommier didn't start this book from nowhere. It just not something that came from nowhere. He was actually aware of the work that Ray Wheeler, who is one of the pioneers of vertical farm, really, who was working at NASA Kennedy Space Center on closed hydroponic system and LED lights. And this work of Ray Wheeler got so influential that we are all aware of the movie The Martian, which is actually a bestseller book. And The Martian was actually based on actual data that Ray Wheeler and his team at Kennedy Space Center have created on potatoes and other things. And you could see on these pictures, there is spring onions there, and there's also kale in the back. Sorry, it's radish in the back, and then lettuce in the front. And you could see like all this kind of thing. You already have done all of that. What that means is when we see today people that kind of talk about, oh, I've managed to grow radishes. Well, good. It was done in the 90s by Ray. And then, oh, I've grown green onions. Well, great. It was done in the 90s by Ray. So all this kind of information is important because it allows that if you know what we already know, you can then switch the conversation to totally different. And, his work is really used today, even so, for many, many different things, including his work on aeroponics. So there is some papers that actually was published by NASA around that time that actually show that aeroponic system were actually more performing than other systems. And people have been using that. And interestingly enough, one of these techniques is actually for potatoes, and potatoes, the potato industry actually used this technique developed by NASA to produce potato seeds and sells them across the world. So it's really a very fundamental and influential work that Ray Wheeler have created, and it's important to remember that. But Dixon Despommier was also aware of the fact that vertical farm or plant factory, as they call it in Japan, really started in Japan long time ago, not in 2010, not in 2000, but in 1980s. And it was not really vertical at that time. It was more a plant factory, only one layer with HPS light. And we all know what high pressure sodium lights, the heat and all of that were a significant problem. But as the light technology evolved, so, you could see here in 1980s, HPS light, 1990s, second generation with fluorescent light, multi-layer this time, and then in 2009, so a little bit before the book of Professor Despomier, LED started to come up and really accelerated in 2012. And if you look also like below in green, the commercial plant factories that were in Japan, you could see that it started with red LEDs, which was the cheapest one, well, not the cheapest one, but the only one available in the 1990s. And then suddenly we started to see red and blue appearing across the 2000, and red was getting a little bit cheaper. And then in the white LED, so the full spectrum really happened around 2015. So the evolution of this plant factory in Japan, we're actually bringing a lot of knowledge to the industry. And unfortunately, many people today forget that there is a lot of knowledge to learn from Japan, because today, even some of these companies are still existing and they're still running, and some of them break even and some of them may be profitable. Of course, it's difficult to really know because we don't see the P&L and all the sheets as we could have, but it just, most of them are actually doing okay. And so it's a stable industry in Japan, and there is definitely a plant factory association that maybe some of you know. And so all of that is just to say that it's not really a new industry. It's an industry that have been changing over time with technology. And then really, and I mentioned that the fact that what really drove vertical farm in the US was the fact that LEDs were becoming more and more affordable. And what that means is when you start in the 2010, and then you go down to the 2019, you could see the decrease of the price of LEDs. It's driven first by the mass production, that's the first thing, but it's also driven by the more efficient lights that we add as well. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, so I'm just keeping it for that. But the reason why LEDs also got mass produced was because it was driven by the cannabis industry. And that's something important to remember as well. If you look at the cannabis industry, have existed since 1996 in the US for medicinal cannabis. Most of the time, it's just a few states really had access to this resource. And then in the 2010s, there were an announcement that more states are going to allow medicinal cannabis. And then that really started booming into the vertical farm, because we have seen a lot of investment in indoor farming, and maybe we could call it just plant factory at that time because it was one layer for most of them. But we have seen a lot of investment into LEDs. And this investment really drove this, the development of the industry in the early 2010, 2015. And at the same time, we have seen the transition, and I hope Nick Clay is going to forgive me to share his pictures there. But one of the things is we have seen the evolution of some small company, which was an OB company, which was Build My LEDs, who I've worked with a lot when I was working at Princeton. And then the transition to this massive and huge worldwide leader into LEDs, which was Fluence Bioengineering. The company got collaboration and bought a few times, and now they're part of Signify. But at the time, Fluence was really the only one to propose full spectrum, quite energy efficient LEDs. And that really what took off in the US and managed the industry to go. As part of their business, of course, the core of their business was focusing on cannabis at the time, because that was the one first with a lot of investment, a lot of money, but also it was the demand was there in a lot of companies. But they also decided to partner with some company, including Bowery Farming, and they decided to partner with this vertical farming company, which puts them in a position of strength. Influence was not just is the influence just in the US. It started also to influence worldwide with some project of cannabis, and others usually start with cannabis actually. But we have seen some projects in Switzerland and other parts of the world where cannabis were getting more and more legalization over there. So that's really the driver of vertical farming, which we don't really have anymore today. And then an interesting paper that I've actually used in my previous research, and one of my students when I was at Princeton in 2019 used this paper to do some study of what it could look like. And this paper in 2014 basically used the works that suggested in the vertical farm to just see what would a skyscraper look like. And so it's a German, actually, I think it's a German study, and they look at one skyscraper like this in Berlin, where they could produce all kind of produce that will feed enough people. And what they look is that, so you could see there's also fish here production, so there's also animal proteins being produced. But the thing that is interesting is it's a 37th floor, and it's really focusing on the capacity of the farm, and what are the increase of factor do they need through technology and so on. All these numbers really don't have necessarily I will say a mathematical basis. It's really just the estimate of like the factor of increase will be that much, and you could see the numbers are really crazy. They're really high. But the thing that is very interesting is I think this study is really pioneer there. It was just showing that if we go with the idea of Dickson Despommier of creating skyscraper, how many people will we feed with just one? And here they just say, well, you could feed almost 15,000 people with one, and you feed them with 2,000 calories per day. And they really just stops there. So what we have done with this study is that we actually analyze the amount of energy that we will be requiring. And just here you could see that it's 2.5 gigawatt hour per year, which is a significant amount of energy. You could think about it. And then the ground space was 1936, so 1,936 meters square. And the price of the building is 230 million. That's more or less 230 million is more or less the price of a skyscraper in New York City or in other parts of the world. You could go, of course, now post-COVID, it's probably double the price, but at the time that was pre-COVID. So that was before, so the price was still quite okay. But if you think of it, if you want to feed the entire population of the US, then it's going to be a significant amount of millions of dollars to invest there. Probably, many tenths of time just the GDP of the country. So that's almost not feasible. It's not possible to do it that way. Then part of the study, what we have looked at is like, okay, well, let's see, we just erased everything in Manhattan and we just replaced everything with this skyscraper production. How much of the population of the US we can feed? So basically what we said is that the study shows that we could feed 1/3 of the population of the US if you fill the entire space of Manhattan Island with the skyscraper, including transportation and everything, and you could feed 1/3 of the US, so 100 million people, which is quite significant. I'm just sparing you the price of how much it's going to cost to just build this building. And just so you know, the amount of energy that you would be require is almost filling some of the nearest state with a nuclear plant to power it. So it's almost crazy, and there's probably not enough uranium on Earth to do it. So this study was quite interesting because we were challenging it and to really understand what the vision of Dickson Despommier could look like. And then, of course, we all remember that in 2005, the FAO released this, I would say, dramatic projection of how much we need to increase the food production. It's a graph that I've been using in many presentations. I think a lot of us are using it, where we need to increase the food production by 77% by 2035. There is a more updated graph from the FAO that got released 2 years ago as well, that actually shows that we are not following the path of producing enough food. And so that just means that, at the time when we reach 9 billion people by 2035, we won't have enough we already don't have enough food to feed everyone. In a certain way, there's still 950 million people not eating enough calories per day, and that would be just make it worse. And so that's the kind of thing that we need to look at. And vertical farm, of course, not saying that we're going to feed the world, but if you remove some area of the land, you clear the area of the land that you can actually grow in a vertical farm, then suddenly you clear the land for growing something else. So that's one aspect of it. And on top of that, of course, there's climate change and a lot of different issues that we have talked about when we talk about vertical farm. So the second part I'm going to focus is in this presentation is really about looking at the industry today. So we have talked about, we just talked about the history. That was what it was in 2015. So now what does the industry look like today? And so this graph in this table in the back was created by Better Food Adventure in 2021. And I don't think I haven't seen an update since then, because the industry is so large in terms of the number of ag tech companies that have been created across the world that the graph is way too complicated now. Sorry, this table is too complicated now. And so it's very difficult to actually find everyone. And so that just means that since that was created, it really has been a very dynamic and a very enthusiastic aspect into the ag tech across the world. And this study in 2017 actually shows that projected vertical farm to be above $12 billion around 2026. So 2026, just since in 2 years from now. Where is the industry today? Well, we probably are pretty close to it. And by 2026, and maybe after that, we'll be way above that. By 2032, I think now the industry is projected to be $26 billion industry. Why? Because across the world, vertical farming are really, really taking off. Yes, we have heard a lot of failure. We have heard a lot of ups and downs. Yes, that's true, but we don't talk about all the success. Usually we tend to talk a lot about the failure and very not a lot of time about the success. And there is a lot of success across the world. People are actually doing some business, whether or not it's profitable, it doesn't matter. Remember the Japanese company like Mirai and others are actually still alive and are still probably breaking even or eventually being profitable today. So there is really all this dynamic across the world. So the industry is there, and many people are reaching out to me on a regular basis to look at, how could we create a vertical farm in a part of the world where there is no vertical farm today? And there's many reasons of doing it, especially with climate change and all the issue. Just for the sake of it here, I just want to mention that France a few weeks ago have released that the production of wheat this year is going to be 30% less than expected, which is massive for the world today. And so that just means that just for a few climate events, we have a huge variation of the production across the world. And so, looking at just indoor farming there, and again, that's 2021, there's probably a lot of things that are missing there. There's some companies that don't exist anymore today. Some are still alive. But you could see this dynamic here of all the vertical farms that were there, and they were still, probably a lot of them are actually maybe missing that, maybe looking at that today and say, oh, my name is not on there. Well, that's true because, again, since 2021, a lot of companies have grown and we are aware a little bit more of them. And so there's really all this dynamism in the industry. Now, what does it look like? What does it look like is that the expansions in 2010 of the industry in North America have really been thriving. And you could see here the number of vertical farms that have been growing across North America. And I always say there's probably some companies that are missing there, but it's quite spread across the US. There's some in Mexico now, in Canada as well. And there is more and more almost every month created and that we are more aware of and being built. So it's really a very dynamic industry even today, even so we have the ups and downs that we have all heard about. And the main reason why it's still a very thriving industry is because we went through what we call the trough of disillusionment. And we are quite past the trough, so the bottom part. And we are starting to go through the slope of enlightenment. And I think the challenge that we have with this with this slope of enlightenment is that we don't want to come back to the trough. And the reason why I'm saying that is just because we need to be very careful when we talk about technology, and we're going to talk about it today, but when we talk about technology and other things, not to overpromise the same way we have done before. And because the hype and the excitement that we have, especially today with AI, will really could affect the industry negatively and slow us down to reach the plateau of productivity. But we are pretty close to the plateau of productivity in different parts of the world, and that's really where the industry is today. And of course, I've shared this different step of the development of the industry, and you could see that as a proof of concept, the technology was extremely important. It was relying on the technologies, a new technology, and you need to prove yourself to that vertical farm was even a possibility or was even a reality. I remember when I started working in vertical farm almost 10 years ago now, a lot of the people that I was talking to say, oh, it doesn't make any sense. It will never work. Why would you do that? And now today, these same people actually came back to it and just say, oh, well, actually, that was making a lot of sense. And even I will say, some of my colleagues, professors or scientists didn't even believe in vertical farm 10 years ago. And now they become some of the experts into the topic. So there's really a shift based on everything we just talked about, but many other aspects as well. And so these different steps really tell you that where we are at the moment, we are in the expansion phase. And then, yes, unfortunately, and that's really sad across industries, there is a risk of layoffs, there is a risk of restructuration, and we have seen that across the industry again and again. And I will say we are now almost at the stage of merger and acquisition, meaning that companies that were not necessarily doing well or had to restructure or to lay off massively now join forces together to try to move forward. And hopefully they will learn from the error of each other. And most of the time is usually the wrong decision at the wrong time that will really affect the entire company. So it's not really about is vertical farm working? It does work. It just, you need to take the right decision and have the right information at the right time to take the right decision. And so I've here just for the sake of it, I just wanted to look at some of the claim, and some of the claim, especially in the early stage of vertical farm, said that the production of vertical farm was 100 times more efficient. And I was like, well, 100 times seems a lot, because 100 times, you just think of like, well, 100 times, why is it 100 times? Usually because it's 10 layers, and so you multiply the yield by 10 almost by just doing that. But how did you actually multiply the yield by 10 as well? So it's 10 by 10, right? And so here I just took an example. Green forest is a classical lettuce you could find. It's a romaine lettuce that you could find in the US. You could buy them from Johnny Seeds and others. And the time in all this information are coming from the website, well, at least a number of days. It grows to maturity in 56 days in the field. The average mass for a lettuce will be almost, a lettuce head will be close to 400 grams, pretty big lettuce. And then, you will plant more or less 1 per square foot, which is 11 per square meter. And then, you have a potential yield when you do all this calculation of almost 4.4 kilo per square meter. And then the number of times that you could harvest in the field is almost 5, because of the 56 days, you won't harvest during 12 months of the year, of course, because it's either cool or too hot. And then you have about 5 harvests. So the yield that you get, the total yield per square meter per year, is across 22 kilos per square meter per year in a very, very good and very productive environment. So another question is like, what is like for vertical farm, or at least indoor farming? And so, first of all, the time to maturity is a little bit shorter. It's 36. We actually did this experiment with one of my students at the Princeton Vertical Farming Project. And we have observed that, yes, the head are slightly smaller, but you could actually condense them a little bit more. So you end up with 5 plants per square foot, 54 plants per square meter, and then you end up with a yield of 13.5 kilos per square meter. Contrarily to the field, because you are indoor, 36 days is to multiply that by 10, and then you end up to be an entire year. So you could do 10 harvests with abattement of 5 days if you want in between, and then you end up 235 kilos. Well, that's definitely not 10 times more. It's only 6.1. So the most, if you do this calculation that way, the 100 times there were actually based on almost nothing. It was just a number being there. It's actually 61 times. I mean, it's still not too bad. And if you think of it, the mass that you could get, you could probably apply a little bit to get close to the 100 times with, of course, the 10 layers. But you know, you are close to it, but it's not exactly the right number. And a lot of people have been questioning the industry because, of course, 100 times looks better. It's a round number, but it's also, you know, it's a kind of a dishonest value in a certain way. And so people have been questioning that, but that's also the context we have at the time. Well, the thing is, while we look at the rest of the crop you can grow, it seems that the yield is kind of stuck and it's kind of limited by what we know from greenhouse or eventually from the field. So if you look at this value, and I assume in a certain way when you look at these values that that's what you could get into a vertical farm based on what, you know, people have been growing, and you could see that spinach, basil, strawberries, chives, and rocket and raspberries there. And you could see that strawberries is these 2 kilos per plant per year. A greenhouse grower will say, oh, if I get 2 kilos per plant per year, that's a very, very productive year, and I'm very happy with that. But is it enough? And if you just calculate the amount of energy and, you know, for a vertical farm, 2 kilos seems limited. But these values are also values that come from the field, and that come from a different infrastructure, that vertical farm. So the question is that, can we use technology to actually go beyond these 2 kilos for the strawberries, or if I just come back to it, the 48 kilos per square meter per year, you know, you could look at that and just say, how could we get just beyond that? Because if we go beyond this value, we could probably be very, very profitable and also make vertical farm a very profitable business. And so technology, we could look at it, and we have heard a lot from many, many companies across the world. We have a new software, and the software is going to help us. We have a new technology, and we have the best technologies that nobody have compared, like nobody have standard of comparison for this technology, but they still have the best. And so if you look at so many companies that have the best system, then at the end, too many best make nothing. And so that's the kind of thing we have heard that because it's a sell point, but it doesn't mean that it have been fairly compared to the other one and what is best and what is not best between these two systems. So it's just is technology really the solution there? So in this part, we're going to really look at what technology are and starting defining what these technologies are. And so I want to start with this first part, mechanical technology. So that's the ones that are kind of like mechanics and also software. And that's really what I want to look into. There's 4 categories there. Number 1, which is automation, which includes growth space management, movement of trays or movement of other things, or gutter eventually. The harvesting stage, where you could totally automate your harvesting, the seeding, the transplanting, the packing, all of that. And there's probably other part of automation, but you got the idea. It's all the parts that you could buy and put into your farm that will make it more efficient. And the second part is the environmental controls. The environmental control will be the HVAC system, your CO2 management, your humidity management, and I will say your humidity management, and it really highlights that you need a humidity management, which is different than your HVAC system. We can talk about hours on that, but that's not the point today. And fertigation, and there is also probably other environmental systems that we don't talk about it, temperature of the water and all of things. So there is a few things that here also are part of the environmental control. Mechanical again. And the third part, and that's a part that have been unfortunately forgotten by the entire industry for the past 10 years, it's energy. We didn't really talk that much about energy, or not a lot of companies have actually focused on making the energy more efficient in a certain way, the farm more energy efficient. And there is multiple options there. Of course, circular economy, we have seen a few farms doing that, mostly the greenhouse, not very vertical farm. Hydrogen, biodigester, LED efficacy, and then we're going to talk about this one. And then the last part is the AI. And so I'm not going to describe too much AI now because I have actually a last part of the talk is about AI. So here there is a few things, and we're going to talk more in detail later on. So let's start with the automation. When we look at the automation is really there to maximize the movement efficiencies. The automation will allow you to first grow vertically without having someone eventually to move things around, but it also allow you to have a pretty stable and standardized system that will allow you to really be very accurate. And just by saying that, you should say, well, that's a problem, because what happens if when you are not that accurate? Let's say you lose power because of a big storm that passed by, and your tray or your gutter is staying in your farm one more day. What happened to the rest? Because you actually seeded already, and so you need to transplant them. So what happened? So that's really what this automation system is. It could be really a gift, but it could be a burden as well. It also accelerates the movement, right? If you have humans that transport first, you have a problem of like safety and all of that. And then you need space for the human to move, so the space is not really great. So it's accelerate all these movements and everything. So that's really what the automation system is. You reduce the need for low-skilled worker, but unfortunately, it also require high-skilled worker for the maintenance. So it actually doesn't really remove that much of your labor. It just displaces the labor from 5 low-skilled worker to 1 very high-skilled worker. If you just take the salary of that, that usually compensate, or you save a little bit of money, but not that much. And it also simplifies the task. But the problem is automation is power, is energy. And we all know that vertical farm today have a problem with energy. Energy consumption is a big problem. So if we think that we are going to solve the energy problem by putting more automation into it, that's actually making the problem worse. And so that kind of the thing is like more automation means more energy requirement, and that's not solving the problem. I'm not saying that some robot could not be super efficient, but at the end, it's still a power issue. And then I haven't talked at all about yields there. And the only thing is that the automation system will give you is a very few percentage of improvement of your yield year round. So if your robots are perfect, and I think it's important for our audience to understand that robots are not perfect. So if someone tells you everything is perfect, is definitely a fool, because we all know our computer fail, and hopefully it's not going to fail today. But you know, they're supposed to be built perfect, but they're not built perfect. And so that's the main thing. If you have something that is really, really like 25 days, or like exactly the number of hours, and then right after you have another tray coming in, and then you have a delay of 5 minutes, everything is messed up. And so that's the kind of thing. It's just like automation will really allow you to be very precise, but it could also allow you to mess up your entire production. So that's the kind of thing where it impacts yield, but it could also impact it negatively instead of positively. So is automation the solution to improve yield, at least beyond the glass ceilings that we have at the moment? It doesn't sound like it. Now, when we look at the environmental control here, again, I'm talking about the system that controls the environment. I'm not talking about the environmental control itself. That's in the next category. But here it's really to deliver, it's a delivery of this condition, which is critical. So it's delivering, the system is there to deliver the right environment for the plant to thrive. And this delivery need to be done usually, you know, for airflow. It will be nutrients at the right time, at the right moment, the right amount of water, the right amount of nutrients, the right amount of light. All these things are important to be tight, because we know that plants will react to this environment and eventually change and change their behavior, or eventually being stressed by it. So it's important to have them quite accurate, and that's what this environmental system gives us. And it also challenge, it could be, this environment unfortunately could also be challenged with external weather. We kind of like tend to forget that, but an HVAC system is still an exchange system, not fully passive, not fully active, but it's an exchange system from the inside to the outside. And if you have a very humid environment outside and you want to remove this water from the inside to the outside, then you have a problem. So you need to really change the way this environment system are done, and you need to adapt to every single environment. This is one of the reasons today where some greenhouse actually don't work everywhere in the world, because most of the greenhouse knowledge that we have today is actually coming from one center in the world. It's coming from the Netherlands, and the Netherlands have a very specific environment, a very specific climate. And yes, we are learning differently by expanding in across the world, but we are still missing some pieces. Like in Australia, we have more sunshine than anybody else across the world. We reach 3,000 micromole per meter square per second of light, when the rest of the world will barely reach 2,500 over the summer. And so that's the kind of thing. We have way more sunlight and the sunburn here that it doesn't have in the rest of the world. Does it mean that the greenhouse don't work? No, it doesn't mean. They will work, but they don't work as efficiently as if they were in the Netherlands. So that's what I'm saying there. We have to, the environmental control and the controls there need to really be accurate and the technique need to be adapted. Can we optimize the growth? Well, it's kind of an indirect way. So we optimize growth manager here. We'll optimize the software. We'll optimize all of that. We all know these big companies that have been producing this software. They are very accurate, very good, but it doesn't push our yield above the glass ceiling again. We just achieve what the expected yields are. So that's really where we are. Then the energy, I think there is a lot of movement into the energy. And again, we haven't really looked into it, but there is green hydrogen and there is a lot of wind, there is solar. Recently, we have, you probably have heard of Oishi in the US that just announced that their next farm will actually have solar panels that will power part of their energy. So that's, you know, we start seeing this kind of like movement of like trying to find the energy somewhere else to not depend on the grid and also to control where the energy is coming from. And so that's all these kind of things. And then we have also example in the greenhouse industry of a lot of sustainable energy being used. We could think of Dyson farming in the UK that actually have a biodigester using the waste of the farms that are around to actually produce power that will power enough energy for the greenhouse. So we have examples around and probably across the world of using alternative energy. Hydrogen is a very interesting one because it really brings a different aspect to power, because hydrogen, yes, you need to source the hydrogen from somewhere. That's a different debate. But if you just use the hydrogen, you actually create water and energy. And where else do we need energy and water, or electricity and water? It's a vertical farm. So there is some interest there. Whether it works, whether it's not, it's not in the debate here. It's just saying that there is technology out there that are available, and we really need to focus on that to make vertical farm pushing in the direction. Does it impact the yield? Not at all. It just produces more energy. So far we have seen 3 different kind of technology that is not really impacting yield that much. And here I want to come back on the energy part of the LEDs. So this is the evolution of the efficacy or efficiency of the LEDs across since 2010. In 2010, when we started, the energy efficiency of LEDs was about 2.5 micromole per joules. Today we are around 3.5, and some of them could be 4, depending on which LEDs we are talking about. But the Department of Energy in the US actually released a paper many years ago now that actually suggested that the maximum values that we could reach for efficiency of LEDs was 5.1. So that's the maximum efficiency. Now, the next milestone we are going to have is 4.5. So if you project that and if we follow the same trend of evolution of technology, which is probably a little bit slower because as we get closer to the maximum, it's going to be more and more challenging. You could see that we will probably reach this maximum efficiency by 2030. So it's not very long from now. It's still 6 years, but in 6 years, we may eventually see this efficiency. Now, if you compare 2.5 to 5, that's 2 times what it was before. So you could eventually decrease your energy cost by 50%, but that's it, no more than that. And then you could see that the next milestone will be around probably 2027, where we will see hopefully the next milestone of 4.5. And if we are not there, then everything is going to be delayed. And of course, as I said, the technology and the challenge every time you move toward, you know, while the next step is harder and harder because you're getting closer to the maximum. But there is some hope there, but we can't rely just on this one to make our farm more efficient. And finally, AI. Again, I said, you know, we're going to talk a little bit more about it in the next category. But you know, it's optimized logistic operation, simplify decision making, help identifying issue, accelerate recovery. And here I'm saying it out loud, not impacting at all your yield. And I'm going to explain why I'm saying that. You have a very low impact on yield, and I will explain why it's have a low impact on yield. But I'm not going to talk about it now. And then there is the second category of technologies, right? We usually think of mechanical technologies, how we could make more technologies. But suddenly we also see that there is 4 categories, which I put here as part of the biologicals. And the first category is breeding. And a lot of people have been talking about breeding. There is definitely now a breeding program for vertical farm. There's a company in France that is dedicated to that called Volts. And now other companies are also doing the same thing. And so breeding for vertical farm become critical because of the critical mass that we have reached. It's important to understand, and I've seen that many times in the US, where the vertical farm thinks they were so big that they were talking to seed company like if they were super important, and the seed company should do something for them. But when you only purchase 1 million seeds per year, when the field is going to purchase 100 million or 200 million or eventually more than that, you're not a big part of their business. But now that the industry is a little bit bigger, more established, we start looking into this evolution, and people start understanding that vertical farm is part of it. So with breeding, you could get better crops, resistance architecture. In biotechnology here, there's a second category. You will have CRISPR and all these kind of like genetic modification that you could make. You could also create hybrids, and biosynthesis is a different aspect that you could do. Third category, pest management. Pest management is something that we tend to forget in vertical farm, because we always say vertical farm pesticide-free, true, but not pest-free. And that's an important part. There is always pest. I just want to cite someone here again, the great Ray Wheeler, who came and visit some farm across the US many years ago when the industry was started. And someone said, "Oh, we don't have any pest." And Ray responded, "It's not about if you're going to have a pest, it's about when. And when you do that, you need to make sure to have a plan." And so that's where this IPM and all of that is there. And ignoring pests is a big, big mistake that many people have done, usually bringing them down. So that's a critical part. And then the last one is, of course, optimize environment here, and that's looking at the biology of the plant and not just at the mechanical aspect of it. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to go through all of that. We talk a little bit about breeding there, and there is different way of doing breeding. We have seen across the world that traditional breeding works very well on wheat. We have seen that with CMIT in Mexico. And for breeding, we could almost use the same approach for vertical farms. The power of it is we certainly have access to 1,000 of different traits, and we could do this crossing and really accelerate breeding for vertical farm, especially that plants are quite plastic, and plastic meaning flexible, and they are able to adapt to the new environment we give them. So that's kind of like, it's important to be able to also breed them in the environment where they're going to grow. We could also use breeding as a way to modify the architecture. Many years ago, in the traditional breeding for the field actually used breeding as a way to select for plants that are strong to wind, strong to eventually drought and others. We don't have all of that in vertical farm, so we actually don't care. If your wheat is actually 10 centimeters tall, it doesn't really matter as long as you have 50 grains on top of it, and you could still maintain it, right? So that's the kind of thing. It doesn't really matter. Suddenly the architecture of the plant can totally change. Some people have been saying, "Oh, why don't we do a tree with strawberries? Or why don't we do, raspberries raspberry plants that actually grow strawberries?" So there's all this aspect that, you could look into. And then biotechnology is there. CRISPR, I think, has been really changing the way people are approaching things. And we could use that as a way of accelerating the reproduction cycles. And that's kind of like, what this technology really brings us. It's a way of tackling the yield and just say we could increase the yield beyond what we have today. That might be a way of using this technology to break the glass ceiling of saying we want a plant that flower all the time and produce tons of strawberries and have a photosynthesis that can allow them. And then maybe we can modify the environment for it. So, there's a lot of things that CRISPR really bring, and we are just at the edge of like getting that started, and we haven't seen anything yet. But the future is really bright for it. Then pest management, again, I mentioned it. It's critical. There is pest, especially when you start growing strawberries in a vertical farm. If your strawberries are coming from the field, if you get plants from the field, the only company that I know of, there's a few companies that start from their plant from tissue culture. The problem of tissue culture is that your plants are actually what we call green, meaning that they produce less because they're closer to the mother plants. They produce less fruit than if they were further away, so multiple generations after. So that's the kind of thing that definitely affect your production. But pest management is something you need to take into account. Your people can move eventually to the farm, and you always have a risk of like bringing an insect, especially over the summer, by mistake, right? And as I said here, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. So it's important to have at least a plan to be able to react in case something happens. And then finally, optimizing the environment is really, it's a dynamic environment. It's adapting to the plant, adapting to the plant. I think I'm going to repeat that a few times. It's not your plants adapting to your system, it's you adapting to the plant. Air circulation, critical. That's the difference between vertical farm and greenhouse. Greenhouse tend to have a very high ceiling that allow a lot of airflow and a lot of air mixing. Vertical farm tend to be dense, don't have a lot of air mixing, and if you didn't account for it, you're not going to grow as well as you could do eventually in the greenhouse. So that's the kind of things that are happening around. Crop specific as well. The environment have to be crop specific. You don't grow a basil or basil in the same way that you grow a lettuce. They're not the same environment. Basil love a lot of nitrogen, a lot of sunshine, a lot of light, a lot of nitrogen and hot temperature. Lettuce, not that much. So that's the kind of thing, you can't really grow them into the same environment. You need to have them specific to the crop to be able to really get where you need to be to break the ceiling of yield as we know it today. And so, as I said, the other thing that we need to take into account when we grow lettuce or when we grow any kind of plants is that the plant we are putting in our system in vertical farm actually have never experienced that before. They have never experienced high CO2. That's number one. They have never experienced constant light. That's the number two. Plants are actually adapted to fluctuating light. And so when you are in the field, plant will be exposed to to cloudiness, and there will be shading coming from different parts. So plants are actually quite flexible with that, and they have adapted systems that allows them to have this constant dynamic. Same thing for nutrient. Plants need to gather to find nutrient in the field. So they have all this system genetically implemented that we need to go against in a certain way by providing them perfect environment. And so we don't really know how they're going to react. And that's a gap that we have at the moment. Same thing, constant water and other things. So all this aspect, because we have this kind of consistency, can be a way of actually pushing the yield way beyond what we know today. And I always say, don't limit yourself to what we know or what is in the textbooks. And I think it's terrible for me as an academic to say that, but don't limit yourself to what's in the textbooks, because there's a new textbook to write. And that's really what vertical farm is about today. It's about rewriting what we knew from I would say, a system that was not the same. Humidity in vertical farm is very important. I mentioned it with the greenhouse, and being able to have turbulent air. We know that very well in plant physiology. We know that turbulent air is better than laminar air. And so if you just use the wrong fan, if you just use a laminar fan, then you are not going to do the same thing that if you do a turbulent one. And that's basically, if you look at the basic aerodynamics law, you are going to brush the air, but you're not going to remove the boundary layer, which is at the surface of the leaf. And boundary layer is a limitation for transpiration. And now what we are seeing is, because of when you take all of that into account, you are actually able to grow tree indoor. And so this is some of the experiments that one of my PhD students, Anna Sharaf, is currently doing here at the University of Queensland, where we are exploring the possibility of growing cacao indoor. And what we have seen is the growth of the plant can actually be maximized and really accelerated almost 300% compared to what is in the field. So we could grow cacao, we will be able to grow cacao and get to the point where, getting to flowers and all that. There is a lot of challenge, of course, that come with that, but that's also what research is about. And when I'm saying research here, I'm not talking about private company trying to grow trees at the moment, because we don't have the knowledge. Remember, the industry got started with lettuce, and we had a lot of knowledge on lettuce, and still today people are struggling. So don't even try to grow something that we don't have a lot of knowledge on. We just need, I would say, just let the people we know trying to take the risk and figure it out. And then when we figure it out, just take it from there. And that kind of, if we think of it, that's the work of Ray Wheeler and others. This was already demonstrated before people took it on. So that's the kind of thing that, we could do it, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And then we could maximize the yield of producing strawberries. Definitely there's, as I said, in the greenhouse, when you normally have 2 kilos, it's a pretty good year. In a vertical farm, you could push it. You could push it to 4. You could push it to 6 kilos. My team in research in my lab have done it, and so we know that it's totally possible. And just by manipulating the environment, no AI, no technology. Well, some technology, but not like no AI, no something fancy. It was just manipulating the environment and looking and understanding what the plants need and giving it to it. So that's kind of like where we are still missing. We are missing. Technology is not going to solve everything. Better grow it before, and then technology is going to be there to boost the 20% left to be even more profitable that you already have. But if you are not profitable with the current techniques with growing your plants, then AI is just going, or sorry, technology is just going to make it worse. It's not the solution. And you know, the thing that we have done as well by using technology, but also by using environmental manipulation and the optimized environment. Again, we are still in the optimized environment category there. And we have been able to also accelerate the production of young plants. We can produce strawberries, we can produce raspberries indoor, and we can produce young seedlings. You will say, why do we need to do that if the nursery industry is doing it? Yes, but the nursery industry is mostly focusing on the outdoor, and outdoor is seasonal. How many people have grown strawberries and run out of plants in the middle of the season because, you know, vertical farm need almost strawberries all year long, eventually, you know, to have your rotation and all of that. And then when you run out of it, I mean, some companies are actually closed down for that because they establish some container strawberries in Dubai where they actually have no access of strawberry plugs, and so where do you get your plants from? And then you have a quarantine issue. So it's important to understand that we could also do it in a vertical farm. And now I think the most important thing here is, like, when we talk about technologies, there is no need to reinvent the wheel. And I think a lot of things we have seen around is people trying to reinvent the wheel. And there's two different strategies. You could always try to reinvent the wheel, which is a waste of time and a waste of money, or you could just use the current technology and build a Ferrari out of it. And then every year you just upgrade your Ferrari to the next level. And I think that's kind of the thing that I see across the industry, that people trying to have their own system and reinvent something that already exists. And we could use technology. I mean, you know, we haven't seen any people using this kind of technology so far for their vertical farm. I think that's an interesting technology that I've seen in Korea and across the world, in Asia mostly. And I think that, you know, why not using this technology? There is technology available. And actually, if you look at some successful story today, like Plenty and others, they actually use some production from car production to move their gutter around. So that's technology that was already available, and they just perfection it and make it better. All right, last category, and I'm going to wrap up after that. It's the AI. So we are entering the AI era, and a lot of people are getting excited about it. But AI, remember, it's artificial intelligence. And to be able to be intelligent, you need to have the knowledge. And if you don't feed your AI with the right knowledge, it's not going to be able to give you the right answer. And the challenge when you think about plants is that it's actually a quite complex environment. I've talked about that in the talk before, but even ecosystem modeling today can't use AI to predict what the environment is going to be or how your forest is going to be productive. We could probably try a little bit, but you will be very, very inaccurate. And in vertical farm, you need accuracy. So because of this complexity, it's actually quite difficult to train an AI that will give you the right amount of accuracy or precision that you need to be profitable. So it's very difficult to think of AI as a way of improving your yield. Now, photosynthesis is complex, and you know, it's just short to say it. We have a model, but we also have this big enzyme here, Rubisco, right in the middle. And Rubisco is one of them. That it's one of these enzymes that is very abundant and but not always active. And so the thing is, plants again have evolved in a way that with the fluctuation of light, they can activate and inactivate Rubisco to be able to fix more or less CO2. And so they adapt and they're quite flexible, which could be an issue. And that's the thing that we actually don't know how Rubisco is going to react to constant environment that we are giving it. And as I said, plants adapt to the environment, and they adapt and acclimate to, or acclimate and adapt to different proportion and different things. They adapt to high light, right? So if you look at the one on the left, you have like low light, middle light, high light, and you could see that the plant curve, that's just a CO2 curve, your photosynthesis is different depending on where your plant has been growing. Same thing for nitrogen. If you grow them under low nitrogen or high nitrogen, of course, the amount of protein is going to be different in the leaf, and it's going to be varying as well. And then finally, this very nice work by Satake et al. There in 2015 have shown that plants are actually able to consume the entire amount of starch they accumulate during the day. This complexity itself makes AI today very difficult to use for just predicting yield or I would say modeling yield, forecasting yield. And then, on the top of that, we have this capillary action in leaves that are quite critical that we don't really need link yet in vertical farm of like, well, are my plant going to transpire all the time? Do they need to transpire all the time? Is there a limitation of transpiration? And if you don't have your nutrient going up or down, if you don't have your water going up, you don't have your nutrient going up with it and your sugar going down. So there's all this complexity into plants that we need to take into account. And unfortunately, if we want to predict everything we want, like the amount of nutrients the plant is going to take on a real time, or all these kind of things, you actually need to have all this information and being able to model it. And so you could imagine the amount of work that remain to get there. I've talked many times of the law of the minima in the past, and that's basically saying that your yield is dependent, is constrained by the lowest amount of one of the nutrient. Could be CO2, could be light, could be anything that the plant needs. And if you just give enough light, then you have another one to take into account. And the thing that is also interesting is that it's the amount and the ratios, the proportion of each of these nutrient will actually could eventually vary and really impact the way your plant grow. So for example, it's not because you're going to give tons of nitrogen to your plant that your plant's going to grow better. At some point going to be saturated, you will be a limitation, and you want to give phosphorus. You don't want to give too much phosphorus because at some point it could become toxic. So there's all this aspect to play with, and we are just learning it. And then, we could look at understanding the nutrient as well. There's tons of nutrients. There's new nutrients discovered every year. The interactions that we have in our vertical farm, how the plants are using, is totally unknown today. We know we have been using it. We know it works, but it's totally unknown. Again, how do you train your model? How you train your AI if you don't have this information? And so, when you think of breaking the glass ceiling, I put this process in place where you say, okay, you have more CO2, now that means more photosynthesis. If you have more photosynthesis, that means there is more water demand, more nutrient demand, and then also more CO2 means tomato closure, less transpiration. We have a problem, less transpiration, more water demand. There is a problem there. So all this kind of process need to be put in place, and the research need to follow with it. There is at the moment some development of what we call digital twins for greenhouse. We are still missing a digital twins for vertical farm, and I think that's probably the next thing that we are going to have. Digital twins allow for training, but they also allow to predict compared to the perfect environment where we are going to be learning how your crops is evolving and eventually taking decisions. Again, it's just a way of comparing. It's not a way of predicting that much. You just know where you were supposed to be and where you're going to get, and how you could adjust to go back on the right line. So that's the kind of things we're still missing that for vertical farm. And then finally, I think it's finding the right balance. There is a balance between the plants. You don't want any excess. Everything is in balance, steady state as we call it. And plant is in steady state and like to be there. And we want to maintain them to be able to really break the yield and eventually push them beyond what they are doing today. Oh yes, that's right. So the last thing that we have done is, we could use this kind of model and predict what eventually could that be with a very strong model. We have done that for wheat, and we have expanded that to rice. But really, the main thing about it's the conversation we need to have about yield. It's not about what we can do or what is the yield today. It's what will it take to get to the yield that will make vertical farm profitable and the yield where you want it to be. And if you start shifting this mentality of like, yes, I can do it, good for you, to what will it take? That's what the paper on wheat was about. It was what will it take to grow wheat indoor? And then if you apply that to every single crop, suddenly you put a roadmap in place of what will it take? Is it energy? Is it genetics? Is it technology? Is it that? And then you answer the question, you troubleshoot it, and you get to the point that you could eventually be profitable. So that's really it about what is next about AI. To be able to unleash AI, we need to have everything we just talked about in place to be able to train our AI, our AI system. Machine learning can eventually help, but if we don't know what that means, we can't really train it for the right reason. So it's getting the right answer for the wrong reason. And so that's all these kind of aspects. There is a list here of like things we need to understand, but there is probably 10 times more than that. And I'm definitely looking for, all the collaborations that I have established with my colleagues and all the work that we hope in the future will help the industry. And I encourage everyone to collaborate and to really get into that direction, because if we want vertical farming to be working and we want to unleash AI the way we are all excited about it, we need to have all this information before we even start to do it. So that's really kind of like the aspect of looking at everything at once and not just one or the others. There is no silver bullet. Is everything at once need to be analyzed, and that's what makes it quite complex. So with that, thank you so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Paul. That was a really interesting presentation, and I particularly liked actually the historical perspective as well. So thanks for that. So if anyone has any questions, I can't actually see people on the screen. So if you'd just like to unmic and ask, or alternatively, if you want to just type your question into the chat box, I'm happy to ask those questions on your behalf. Okay, maybe I'll kick off then. So I was very interested in this aspect of breeding for vertical farming and improving crop productivity that way. But we know from I guess conventional breeding, right, our yield increase has been slowing now over quite a long period of time, and those gains seem to be getting smaller and smaller. And in some cases, we're sort of approaching theoretical maxima of what those yield limits are. So are there any particular areas where you think that there's still quite a lot of genetic gain to be had? And how does that indoor environment influence our capacity to achieve that genetic gain?
Yeah, I think the genetic gain could be done. I think I will take the example of wheat again for the genetic gain. I think we are limited by the number of grain we could have per stem of wheat because of the wind and because of the way the stem can, really hold it. With the vertical farm, I think one of the big aspects is you could actually create a system that will hold the plant in a certain way to hold it. So you use technology as a way of, I would say, unleashing the number of, maybe doubling the number of seeds. I don't know. There's some technology we could get there, but I do think that's where it is. It's combining helping the plant. Suddenly we put something to help the plant, getting beyond what we could do in the field outside. Yeah. So yeah, that's why I'm seeing it.
Okay. Any more? Oh yeah. So we have a question here from Thea, which is, when you're talking about collaboration, what kind of stakeholders do you? I guess the question is, what kind of stakeholders do you anticipate being involved in those collaborations?
Well, I usually say smart people collaborate, and so I will say everyone need to be involved. I mean, the industry, I think the biggest problem that the industry have today is the lack of collaboration that we have seen within, when other industry actually collaborate quite a lot. So I think the issue, and we are talking about farming here, we're not talking about anything else. So if it's collaboration about technology, yeah, maybe not. But growing a plant, it makes me furious when I hear a company telling me that the recipe or the nutrient solution is actually IP. It's not, because nutrient solutions, there's books of Ogland solutions that everybody can have. And honestly, you don't want to be your IP, because if your IP, it's a burden for you. So that's the kind of collaboration. I think, if you go to the greenhouse industry, they collaborate quite a lot. Like, people will help each other and will tell them, oh, I found this new technology, it really helped. Oh, I found this new recipe, is really great. They stay inside the industry. It doesn't stay outside. It's difficult for newcomers to get this information. But for the ones that have been in the industry for quite a long time, they collaborate. I went many times to NASGA, which is the North American Strawberry Grower Association. And growers would just say, last year we did this and this, and we did this nutrient, and they will share their recipe and their knowledge with each other. Even so, they could be like in Quebec and all producing strawberries, but at the end, it's better to be together than dying alone. And I think, unfortunately, with the vertical farm today, we see a lot of companies that die alone, and their IP disappear. And I think that's what infuriates me in a certain way, because this knowledge is lost. And when the knowledge is lost, we just have to recreate it. When collaboration need to be, as there should be, partnership between academia and industry. And yes, I've heard the criticism many times from the industry that academia is slow. But if you are someone like myself, who actually understand industry and understand academia, you could actually empower it to the point that it's going to be really, really, powerful what you could do. And some company have done it. So it's like, University of Arkansas doing some collaboration on, on black raspberries. And there's a few universities that start doing this collaboration, but we need to do more of that. And we also need to have the capacity of collaborating between, even, within an industry. I'm thinking PTM, for example. PTM is a big problem across the industry. There is not just PTM, there is also pathogens. It just, what is the IP? You manage to get PTM, great, but you are just one company and you need to build a farm, which is going to cost you 125 million. You're not going to conquest the world every time because you need 125 million to build a farm. So you better collaborate with each other and help. So then you build an industry. And when the industry is built, it's strong. So, yeah.
Thank
everyone.
You. So we have a question from Nina Tribanova, which is, are there any companies that you think in the industry that are doing it right?
What? The growing or what?
I guess have the correct approach might be the nub of that question.
Yeah, I think there is people that are doing it right. There is, if you want names, I don't want to put them on the spot there, but so I don't really want to put names. I'm happy to have a separate conversation on it, but there is companies that are doing it right, and I think that's the one we probably don't hear of, right? There is success story in the greenhouse industry in the US. For sure, very strong success story. The greenhouse in the vertical farm, there is also a success story, but we just don't hear about them because they don't brag about it. And I tend to say, usually when I see an announcement on LinkedIn about, something exciting that they have discovered something, that's usually a sign that they need money, and it's not the sign that they're doing well. So that's usually what, that's kind of the thing. We have seen that across the industry. When you start seeing a lot of PR going online on LinkedIn, and PR, that's usually because it's the next round of funding. So either they fail or either they succeed. And so that's the kind of things that the ones that don't talk about what they're doing. Did you actually know that there is like that many Japanese company doing well? Probably not that much because they don't brag about it. There is also a company in Korea doing vertical farm. We don't know about it because they don't brag about it. So that's the kind of thing. So to me, it's just like, yes, there is definitely company doing well. And I've definitely visited some of them. So I know that there is company doing well, but we just don't hear about it.
Thank you. So a question about digital twins. Are the vertical farming digital twins under development at present, and where are we at with that particular development?
So I think the digital twin for vertical farm is just at its infancy. We have to, that's something that my team have been looking into developing, just because we have digital twins here for outside farm as a way of optimizing pesticide application and others. I was we were thinking of doing that for vertical farm. Again, the challenge is we don't actually know how the plant performs. So you could get something that will be close to it, but not close enough. And there is all these big, the two major, I'm not going to mention their names, and I'm not doing advertisement, but the two major Netherlands provider for equipment for fertigation and others are actually doing some, have enough data now that they've been in business for so long to actually do digital twins of greenhouse, and they work actually quite well. So we just don't have enough access to enough data in vertical farm to be able to do the same at the moment.
I think that's right, because if you put the wrong data in, then your digital twin's as good as useless, right? So absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
So then another question, which is a little bit further away, and it's really, the question is about how you see, obviously, a lot of what's spoken about is big investment, it's high technology, and how does vertical farming apply then to sort of developing countries, and how might that mixing with the development of capacity to feed people in those countries? And actually, you know, would they be better off going down the conventional farming route? Does VF compete with that? These kinds of questions.
Yeah, it's a very complex question, and so I will try just to summarize by saying, you know, I could just say try to read the wheat paper, but the main thing that is the reason why the wheat paper is an interesting one is because one of the things that we said in this paper was there is something beyond money, and there is something beyond there that we don't really talk about, and the fact that you know, there have been studies that have shown that the reason why there were the Arab Spring many years ago was because people were starving. We know that the Syrian war got started because people were starving. And so we know the price of war, right? War is extremely expensive. So now if you need to feed your people to just stabilize your country, how much are you willing to spend? And so spending, you know, you could think you need to build a bridge. Yeah, a bridge will cost in the third world country or in, you know, in developing country or in other countries. A bridge will cost. If you build a new airplane or if you build a new airlines, it will cost you some money. And so to me, just like it's beyond that, there is something beyond that that we need to take into account. And that's always what I bring onto the picture. You mentioned traditional farming versus vertical farming. And I think that's a very strong debate there because the problem is climate change is affecting so much the way we grow. Is it even worth it in some countries to even try to grow outdoor? Like I always say, you know, like traditional breeding is amazing. And I think we have been doing so well for so many years, considering the rough environment we are growing into. And I'm in Australia, so believe me, I know what rough environment means. And so, you know, but is it even worth it, right? Because by the time you get your new species ready for the field, your climate is already obsolete. And so that's the problem that we are having tonight, because we are seeing this acceleration of the climate transition, unfortunately, to something very extreme. The climate change too fast compared to what we can do in the field. And I think that's where vertical farming can help. And I always say, well, actually, if you think of it in terms of money wise, you better invest in something now that will cost you money. The longer you wait, there is this projection of like, should I wait to invest in the future, like climate solution and other, or should I invest now? It costs a certain cost today, and every year you pass, it costs you more because the consequence of not doing it is actually higher. So the longer you wait, the longer it costs. So for developing country, I always say, there is people doing vertical farm. I can tell you there is vertical farm in Kenya, there is vertical farm in many different countries in Africa as well, and that, you know, developing countries. There is you know, in many countries also in Asia. I mean, Malaysia and Vietnam and others are definitely developing vertical farms today. And again, that's to address some of the issues that they have. Now, should they grow everything? Probably not. Can they grow everything? I don't know. But I do think it's an effort we should all pursue. And yes, make it more affordable. That's true. But a cost is a cost. And the other thing that I mentioned to farmers in Australia, because there is some barriers as well of developing vertical farm in Australia, because our attitude is, well, we have a big country, small population. If we need to produce more, we just occupy more land. That's kind of the attitude we have taken for ages. And I always say yes, but the main thing is in the field, a farmer can barely predict what the weather is going to be in 1 or 2 years. So what that means is that because they can't predict the weather, then they invest very low amount of money. But in a vertical farm, I always say, as long as I have power, I can predict my weather 5, 10, 50, 100 years from now. As long as my infrastructure is done the right way, I can produce and I can predict and I can know exactly how much income I'm going to make and how much production I'm going to make. That's a luxury a farmer will never have. And we are seeing it here in Australia. Every time we have a major weather event that affect our farmers, there's a flooding or the storms, everything, 50% of the farmers affected run out of business, because Australia is the only country in the world where farming is not subsidized. It's actually a business. And so if you can't sell your crops for 2 years, you basically run out of business. So we have seen that here as significantly affecting, again, linked to climate.
So if you can overcome that capital barrier, then perhaps vertical farming is a much lower risk enterprise than conventional farming.
Yeah. I usually say vertical farm de-risk farming. So.
Okay, so there are no more questions in the chat. If anyone would like to ask any more questions, then please go ahead. If not, I think I'd just like to thank you very much, Paul, for that really fascinating talk. And perhaps, Raman, I don't know if you want to say anything about future APGC seminars, or will we just leave it there? No, I don't. Oh, and we have one more question by the looks of it. No, we don't. I think that question was a mistake. Thank you very much, Paul. And thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thank you for having me. Have a good one. Bye-bye.